Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For our free wire tutorial today, I'd like to share with you a design where you can take a crystal point or an inverted flat obelisk if you prefer, and hold that safely with wire as a pendant. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look at the project we're going to work on together. So the flat obelisk that I'm working with actually does have a drill hole, but we're going to pretend that that isn't there and we're going to not use it. I'm working with 3 gauges of wire today. I've got 18 gauge or 1mm as my main wire. I've got some weaving wire at 0.4mm or 26 gauge, and I've got a little bit of extra wire down at the base here in a slightly stronger gauge, which is 0.5mm or 24 gauge. We're not using a huge amount of each of those wires, and it will securely hold your pendant in position so that you can wear that however and whenever you desire. I really love these pieces. So to begin with, we're going to start with 2 6-inch lengths of 18 gauge or 1mm wire. Let's just pop this out of the way for a moment, and we're going to just warm those both through ever so slightly so that we can get a nice smooth start to the process. The wire I'm working with today is a German style, which is a medium temper. You could work with a firmer hard wire if you like, but the medium temper is absolutely ideal. So let's just put those 2 down for a second. We're also going to be working with some finer gauge wire now. In order for this design to be least offensive to your desktop, I'm going to be working from the reel. Now you can cut a length of wire for this if you like. Probably around about 20 inches or so will be more than plenty. I prefer to work from the reel because it gives me an opportunity to be least wasteful. So let's grab one of these lengths of that heavier gauge wire to begin with, and I'm going to start about 1/3 in from one end, and I've got a good 6 to 7 inches of wire, the finer gauge wire, over or under. We're going to start by winding 3 times around one of those, and then we're going to give ourselves a basic figure of 8 weave. So like I said, I'm starting about 1/3 from the end, and I've got about 6 or 7 inches of wire up here. So with the figure of 8 weave, you can have this really tightly wound together, as I have done in the sample here, or you can have a little bit more of a gap if you prefer. I'm going to introduce the second heavier gauge wire in. Now there is a dedicated video which I'll just put a link up to for you now, and that will be for the figure of 8 if you need that demystifying. It's very simple once you get going. So in order to make my life easier, I'm going to introduce the second heavier gauge wire over the top of the finer gauge wire, which has come off the top of this side. And I'm going to just slide that so that it goes underneath the other one. And in that way, I've already got a couple of my weaves ready to go. So why don't we make this just a little bit distant apart? You can completely fill your wire with weaving if you like, or you can do a slightly faster build, which is where we have gaps and we take the passes of wire at a diagonal. So I think probably we'll do a very gentle diagonal and just have small gaps. So I've taken the wire over the top of the lower of the 2 bars, underneath the upper of the 2 bars, and I'm going to wrap again 3 times around the upper wire. Draw that down the centre and just allow that to sit for a moment whilst I tidy that little weave segment up. So you can, as I say, you can get this really tight, or you can have little gaps and it looks a little bit like a ladder. So I'm going to do a couple more weaves with you, and then I'm going to whiz through and fill several inches of this section with that figure of 8 weaving. So I'm coming over the top of the lower wire, down between the 2 tram lines. Trying to keep these an even distance apart as we move through will give you a much neater finish. Underneath, and then we're going to go all the way around 3 times. So that's the second pass, that's the third pass, all the way down. And every time I have done one of those little 3 wraps, I'm going to give that a scooch and move on to the opposite side. Now the propensity is for those 2 tramline wires to come closer together. You could use a ring clamp if you wish to help keep those safe, but what I tend to do is just give it a bit of a go, see how it looks, that looks relatively even. If they've come a little bit too close together, you can pop the tip of your chain nose pliers inside and very gently open that out until you get that equal distance between those two tram lines. So what I'm going to do now is fill a good probably 2.5 to 3 inches of the central section of my two heavier gauges with infill, and then I'll join you back in a moment and we can continue to the next stage. So once I've finished that 6 or so inches of finer gauge wire on the one side, I can flip the design over and continue weaving in the opposite direction until I've got that central 2.5 to 3 inches of wire completely woven. So the weave will work in exactly the same way. If you're coming underneath one of them, you need to go over the top of the opposite one. Let's just give that a quick wrap. 1 and 2 and 3. You can go really quite quickly with this once you get a feel for the wire. It's very easy to accidentally mangle one of these longer pieces of the heavier gauge wire. Even though it's a lovely 1mm, it's very easy to pull it out of shape. So if you're newer to wire weaving, just allow that to take its time. So I'm going to continue along now until I get as far as I wish, having filled the middle section and leaving a good sort of 1.5 to 1.75 inches of bare metal at either end. So I've continued my weaving. I changed my mind and went for a fully closed up weave. It's still exactly the same, 3 and 3 figure of 8 weave, or ladder weave if you prefer. And what we have here is 1 3/4 inches of naked wire at either end, and in the middle there's 2.5 inches of that weave. Now if you've allowed yourself 20 inches of that finer 0.4 or 26 gauge, that will be plenty to give you a nice zigzaggy open weave. If you want to do that closed up weave, I would always suggest working from the reel, because depending on how far apart your little tram lines are or how much tension you're going to put into it, it's really difficult to gauge in advance exactly how much wire you will use. So let's head down to the board and move on to the next step of our tutorial. So you can see that really quite tight and tense figure of 8 weave I've undertaken. Gives quite a nice machined finish. So what we're going to do now is splay apart either end. Now if you're looking to have symmetry in your designs, which I quite like in a design like this, what we're going to start by doing is making sure that we have an equal distance of wire at either end of the weaving in the centre there. And we're also going to make sure that those are nice and close together in terms of their length, and that they have been trimmed super flush and tidy. Then we're going to begin with our round nose pliers, and we're going to start coiling those away from the centre of the weave, just around and around, to begin with a nice little tight form like so. So let's do the same on the other side. Trying to keep those a very similar shape and size will give you that nice element of symmetry at the end of the design. And I'm just going to squish them down, make sure they're completely flat before beginning an open spiral. Now your wire may have seen a little bit of action at this point. Sometimes you will have made it slightly tense by moving it around whilst you were doing that weaving, opening it up and so forth. So if you need to, you can just put a little bit of warmth into that wire first. This is a raw copper that you see on the demonstration piece, and it's already started to develop its lovely dark patina, which is something to do with skin chemistry. Some people will make that patina happen quicker than others. So I'm just going to splay those wires apart in the centre, and I'm now going to try and recreate that open spiral on the second side. So for me, I'm just going to flip it over. The weave being what it is, as long as you finish cutting your wire after the third wrap and snip it away inside and give it a smooth, it doesn't have an upside or a downside at the moment. So what I tend to do when I'm making an open spiral is allow the finger on my non-dominant hand to support the spiral, and I'm just going to push into that gently and in a very slow, controlled fashion, utilising my chain nose pliers. I always use my bent chain nose pliers. If you find that one of your spirals is slightly more open than the other, you can very gently give that a little pinch by putting the pliers in the centre and on the next available swoosh. And then we're just going to push that up. It looks a bit like a rocket ship at the moment. So As at this moment in time, I'm not fussed that they're not identical, but you can take a little bit longer and you can try and get those to be much more similar. So you can see it's slightly flat over here. If you wanted to continue to use that, you can use your chain nose pliers across the wire to gently modify that. Again, you can give it a little bit of warmth and heat just to make your life slightly easier, just to redress that balance. Obviously, once you've done all that weaving, it's a bit of a pain to try and get that all off onto some new wires. So where possible, take care to get that as similar as possible. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side, but you've already seen me do that once, so I'll join you back in a moment. So the next thing we're going to do is form our bail. Now I have made a dramatically oversized bail because I think that this is a piece that could be worn by any gender, and I like to think that it gives you more options when you have an oversized bail as to what chain or clasp you're going to be able to thread through that gap. So I'm going to grab my trusty mandrel, a marker pen, and you could use any round form that you desired, the largest point on your bail makers if you have them. If you wish to give that a little bit of an extra warm through, I'm just going to open and close thumb and forefinger over that central section. At this stage I don't want to be rubbing the wire because I don't want to move it around. It's where I want it to be, but I do want to put a little bit of warmth into it. It's quite a toasty day here in the UK. What we're going to do is find that centre point and wrap that around so that those spirals are going to come together like so. So they're sort of sitting on top of each other. Let's move the mandrel out of the way. Mandrel, she says. And what we're looking to do at this stage as well is to make any refinements. Now, whilst you won't see the front side and the rear side at the same time, you might like these to be identical. So you have an opportunity now to just tidy up these little open spirals to try and get one to sit on top of the other so that they reflect each other more accurately. For me, that's close enough for today. You could do a little bit more if you wanted to. Now we're going to slide in our gemstone or crystal sliver, or point if you prefer, and just have a look at how things are coming together. So at the moment, that's quite a broad spiral, which means that it won't be tight enough to hold the piece in position. That's absolutely fine because we have the opportunity to close that spiral up a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is pinch and then pinch again, and you'll see that we can just bring this ever so slightly closer together. Gentle movements until that sits a little bit closer, and then we'll do the same on the other side. To be fair, the wire's still reasonably warm, so you may be able to just arch that in a little bit. What we're looking for is to have those spirals sitting just slightly wider than the face of your crystal slice or crystal point, because the next thing we're going to do is tie them together on these outsides of each of those segments. So in order to make our life easier for us, we're just going to pop that back in for a second and then gently coerce those little open spirals sideways so that you get a little bit of a tilt. You can see what I'm doing with my right hand. If you need that to have a little bit of mechanical help, you can very, very gently grab each spiral and point it inwards. If I show you what it looks like without the point in, you can see they're starting to meet in the centre. Exactly the same on the other side. You'd probably be better off with standard chain nose than bent chain nose pliers. If I flip that over the other way, you can see what we're getting towards creating the top of the basket of the design. So let's just slide that back in again. That's starting to look pretty good. So with this design, I've added a safety net. Rather than relying on the tension, which we're going to create by tying these two outer spirals together to hold everything in position forever, we're going to add a little swirly whirly and some safety wires down at the bottom of the design. I think it looks beautiful over a stone like tiger's eye. You don't necessarily have to have it. If you can get enough hardness into these loops, these open spirals that we're looking at now, then you probably won't need to worry about it. However, what I would say is these are open spirals. So unless you're going to prise this back apart and hammer those, there will always be a certain fluidity, a certain openness, because it's a spiral form. You can help the situation by giving that a little bit of work hardening with your flat facing pliers. in this instance my bent chain nose pliers. Give that a hearty little squish. Once you've got that position set, couple of opens and closes. You can really press quite firmly at this stage, like so. The next thing we're going to do is sew up one of these sides, just the one to begin with, and then we'll think about adding in that little S shape down at the bottom. So to sew the side together, we're going to grab some more of that 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. I'm working in gold today because either gold, bronze, copper, all will work beautifully. And hey, if you want silver, and then you can add some patina to that as well. A dark silver looks beautiful with tiger's eye, but whatever you fancy doing. So what we're going to do to start off with is add our finer gauge wire, and I'm working with a scrap from my scrap pot. It's around about 5 or 6 inches in length. It'll probably do both sides to be fair, but just on the safe side, let's grab a 6-inch length. And I'm just going to hold on to around about an inch or so over the end, and I'm going to loop the wire around the lowest part of my open spiral. So I'm sewing on just down here. So that's 1 loop, 2 loops, and a 3rd loop. And then because I've got plenty of this wire, and this is a scrap length from my scrap pot, what I want to do is trim away that excess and tuck the tail end far away from sight or harm. And to do that, it's a little bit tricky to see, not tricky to do. Just going to give that a tiny rotation with the tip of my pliers and get that nice and neat and tidy. What we're going to do now is scooch that over to one side. Let's get those pliers out the way. And if I pop the pendant or the slice into position, you can see what's going to happen next. We're going to take that across at the side. So if I remove the gemstone from the equation, we're going to continue with our figure of 8 style weaving. So you can probably see that the finer gauge wire is coming over the top of the spiral at the top there. So that means I want it to come underneath the wire on the spiral on this side. So if I just hold that super steady, it's come over the top of the spiral on one side, so it's coming underneath the spiral on the second side. Now, if you're canny, you can loop the wire around and draw it inside the spiral. But in a moment, we're going to do the same thing on the far side where you won't have that opportunity. So I'm going to show you how to achieve this without that looping manoeuvre. There goes the camera again. So we're going to bring that tail up inside the spiral on the lower side as you're looking at it. I'm going to draw that around. Now I want that to come really close together, but not touch. So it's connected with 1.5 wraps at the moment. I'm going to drop the pendant into position and make sure that there's going to be enough space, and check how close I want those wires to come together. Well, it would seem that these wires need to tighten up all the way because I made those spirals quite large. So very, very gently, I'm just going to coerce those 2 spirals from either side. Let's just centralize that for a second. I'm going to allow them to sit almost side by side. So let's go for another wrap. You can make little almost fish hooks to go up inside that spiral, whatever it takes to make your life easier. Control that wire as it goes round until you get your 3rd wrap. So we're currently over the top of the spiral just here, which means I want to go underneath the spiral on the other side. So just pull that all the way through. Now I have gone for 3 wraps because it matches the wrapping on the bail up at the top there. Give that a little bit of a tighten up. And what I did on my demonstration piece is 3 points of connection on either side. So 3 stitches, 3 stitches, 3, 3, 3 and 3. And I think that gives us a nice strong connection between those 2 spirals. So let's get that second one going on the upper side. Again, hitting the camera whilst trying to get the tension done. So I'm going to go for 3 wraps around the upper spiral, and we're always going from underneath to over the top or vice versa. So we're coming over the top of the spiral here. I'm going to push the wire up inside that spiral on the other side, control the flow of the wire, tighten it up neatly, and then I'm going to go for 3 wraps on this side. So I'm just going to continue. So I've got 3 of 3 on either side, and then I'll meet you back here in just a moment. So I've got the first side done. We're going to head back down to the board now and I'll show you how to start the second side. The process is exactly the same, it's just a little bit more fiddly to see once that crystal slice is in position. So let's head back down and crack on. So in order to add the other side's weaving, we need to slide the crystal point or slab into position, and then just make sure that we're happy with how everything lines up. If I just get my fingers out the way, you can see that those two coils are just about touching. The little bit of extra tension we're about to add in will really bring that together. So the process is exactly the same. So I'm going to start with around about 6 inches of 0.4 or 26 gauge, put a little bit over the top just to make life easier, and we're going to start by rotating at least 3 times around that connection point. Now what I will do is just tighten that coil up, and again make sure that the cut end finishes off inside that coil so that with any luck it doesn't ever come back to haunt us. Let's give that a little rotate to make it sit down flat, and then we'll squish that over into position. Now it's going to be trickier to see, but I promise you the process is exactly the same. Let me just get that tricky little end to sit down. I've just seen I didn't quite get it flush. If you don't do it now, it will just haunt you later. And there we go, nice and smooth again. So what we need to do is, because the finer gauge wire is coming over the top of the coil on the left, we need to bring that round underneath the coil on the right. Now before I bring any tension into this, I'm going to introduce the stone, slide that all the way up into position. You might catch the wire, the finer gauge wire slightly, and we're going to weave this together just slightly lower in the final position. So it'll probably end up somewhere up here by the time we've added some shaping into that bail we've made, but we need it just to be slightly lower so we can get some tension. I'm going to scooch that coil down so it's at the lower edge of that connection point, flip it to its side, pinch that together, and then we're going to rotate 3 times around that lower spiral. So the technique, as I said, is exactly the same. We're going to control the flow of wire through, make sure that they don't cross over, and then we're going to wrap 3 times on the lower spiral. I'm not going to make you watch the whole thing again, just control that wire as it comes through. If it gets a bit tense, as this is because it's an offcut, just coerce it into position. If you care about your nails more than I do, I obviously care about your nails, I simply don't care about my nails. Just use your pliers to tighten that up slightly. So over the top again to come underneath the other side. Control the flow of wire with another finger if you need to. Don't allow them to cross over. Just hold that until it sits neat. So I've got 1 wrap of 3 at the top, 1 wrap of 3 at the bottom. I'm going to again continue off camera now. 3 wraps, 3 wraps, 3 wraps, 3 wraps. Cut the end and tuck the cut end away, and I'll meet you back here in a moment. So at this point we've got a reasonably tense connection to our gemstone, but unless you've worked with a much heavier wire up here, or you took the time to hammer those spirals, or maybe you've used a slightly heavier wire on that connection point, you could very easily go for 0.5 and 24 gauge and still get the same look, a little bit more strength. I tend to not stop at this position. It's quite tempting to do so. If you want to have your finished piece look like this, then do consider hammering those coils or using a heavier wire. Now to move on to the next section, I'm just going to very gently draw the frame up to the top end of the pendant piece, and we're going to look at creating a couple of matching spiral sections to sit over the surface and to further strengthen our design. Now you will need, again, the same gauge of wire. I'm using a gold colour German style 18 gauge 1mm wire. And I've got some 3-inch offcuts. Now that's just what I'm working with, that's what I have to hand. You could take that up to 4 inches and have a few more swirly whirly sections. What you'll need to do is to make 2 that are reasonably similar to each other. It certainly pays to have them made from the same length of wire. So let's just pop these 2 chaps up to the top for a moment to clear the board. So I like to have them so that one end is a little smaller than the other, otherwise it can look a little bit forced. So we start with our spiral, grab hold of that and start rotating the wire around in a very similar way to when we were creating these spirals. Look like little eyes at the moment on an owl or something. And once we've got a good spiral going at one end, I'm going to flip that over to the other side. Start by rotating away from me. So I've got one coil coming down. I'd like the other coil to go up. So it's more like an S scroll. And again, I'm going to give that a quick squish to make it neat and tidy. These do need to be open spirals, but I tend to close the first loop up so it's less likely to scratch the stone or you. What we do need to have is space at the top and the bottom of this scroll. So if we take a look at this scroll here, probably not enough space in that gap up at the top to wind wire into it. So you can very, very gently make that first loop smaller, preferably without stabbing yourself in the finger, and then get a little bit more of that coiling going on at the top of the design. What we're looking for, if I put this on the imaginary straight line, we need to have an access point over the 12 o'clock and down here further off to one side, sort of at the 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock positions. So this will work really neatly. We're connecting at 12 o'clock, and then if you imagine that this is a clock face in its own right, again at 3 o'clock and at 9 o'clock. So you've got 3 points of connection on the design just to add that little bit of extra security to the design. So I've made a second little scroll, or S scroll if you prefer. They're reasonably similar, but they'll never be seen in the same time, so it doesn't really matter if they're not 100% identical. They're reasonably close. So we're going to now work that into the design to strengthen the capture that the wire has on the gemstone. We're going to now add our S scroll onto the design with the smallest of those two shapes connecting up to the open coils where we began our tutorial. So we're going to start off by taking the new scrap of 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, and as I said, you need to have space over that 12 o'clock position. I'm going to find the approximate centre of my scrap of wire, and I'm going to rotate around in a way that I can scooch that up to the top like so. I'm going to go probably for around about 10 wraps or so. We'll see what that looks like, and we'll offer that up to see if it fills the gap between those two scrolls. Let's have a look. I think probably another turn around on the right hand side and we will be there. So we need this to sit. Let's pop it back on the imaginary straight line. We need that section of coiling to sit right at the top so that once it's in position it will be nice and symmetrically placed. So that looks reasonably decent to me. The finer gauge wire is coming over the top of the right hand of the top of that scroll, which means that I want it to go underneath the wire that we're attaching to. So we're always following the same principle of if it's coming off the top of one, we want it to go underneath the other. Let's just get that into position. And I want those two scrolls, the new scroll we're adding and the open coil we began with, I want them to sit flat side by side. I'm going to draw that tail of wire that's come over the top of the scroll underneath that open coil and pull it neatly back down towards me. And then I'm going to take the tail and pop that underneath the coil wire again. So it can at this stage get a little bit fiddly, but it's all perfectly achievable. Pull that around so you can see that we've made that connection point. The gemstone slab or slice will still move around at this stage. We're going to fix that shortly. So I'm going to go for 3 wraps to add that connection into position. So again, taking that wire up underneath the coil wire, bringing that around, we've got our second wrap in position, and I'm going to draw that over the surface. You will find things slide around a little bit at this stage. That's absolutely fine. It will all come together. I'm going to trim just past that top point, making sure I'm trimming only the wire I need to get shot of. And then I'm going to make sure that that pointy end bit sticks down and out of the way. So giving that a gentle coerce moves it into position. We're going to just centralise the S scroll. As I said, those little coils up at the top here do need to be in the middle, as if it's symmetrically placed. and then we're going to pinch everything together while we flip to the other side. Now the finer gauge wire is coming underneath the scroll at this stage, which means I need to take it over the top of the connection point on that coil. So I'm going to push the wire down and just push that all the way through. Pull that. You can see that's a little bit loose at the moment, so if I pinch, I can just very slowly control that wire until it sits flush up against, and you've got that connection between the two pieces of scroll work. You've got your coil and then you've got the S top just here. You might need to just push that around slightly until it fits exactly. So we're going to go for another 2 wraps on this coil to make sure that we've got our 3 wraps to keep everything nice and safe. If you're struggling at all with wire tension, you can use your pliers to just help you get a little bit of extra tension. I think one of my wires has crossed over, so I'm just going to pull that out slightly. There we go. Unsolved, she says. Solved the issue just by very gently giving it a bit of a waggle. A waggle is often the way forwards. So I'm going to push that wire through again, control as it goes around, and then we're going to tighten up that little coil in just a second, like so. And I'm going to truncate the wire so that it sits flush behind that coil. Very, very slowly, looking twice, cutting once, and then hopefully not crying. It can be quite disheartening if you cut the wrong bit. So we've now got that connection in place, and again you'll see that there's a little bit of tension up here already, but we want to make this really, really safe. So let's flip over to the other side. Here's one that I did a moment ago off camera. It's exactly the same technique. We've just added those 2 little S scrolls into position. It also pays at this stage to just feel around, find out if there are any annoying sticky up parts that will catch you out later, and deal with them accordingly if you come across them. For the last part of the tutorial, we're going to connect the 2 scrolls together across the side. Now, the wider you make the scroll, the less obtrusive that will appear. So if you wanted to work with slightly longer, these were 3-inch scraps. If you work with a 4-inch scrap, you'll be able to make a much larger loop down at the bottom. Give that a bit of a pinch, and you can create a very, very small connection point. I don't mind seeing the wire either side. It's just an option for you if you prefer it to be slightly more seamless. Work with a slightly longer piece of wire. Like I said, I'm working with scraps again today because wire can be a little bit expensive, and I do go through a lot of it on this channel. So I've opted to use a 0.5mm 24 gauge wire to connect these 2 scroll sections together, and all we would do is exactly the same as we did on this piece. We're going to just draw them across the side of that gemstone slab or slice or inverted obelisk. So I'm going to try and find my, here it is. It's in a different colour, but I don't suppose it matters. So this is 0.5mm or 24 gauge. And I'm going to grab hold of, this is probably around about a 6-inch length. And exactly the same way as we did up at the top earlier, I'm going to find the middle or so of that piece, and I'm going to wrap it around just so that I can get a good place to connect. Now, in an ideal world, you'll have a longer piece of wire than this, and you'll be able to fill all of this S shape with beautiful, neat, tidy wraps of wire. I don't think I have enough on my desk right now, so I'm just going to show you on the one side, and I'll tidy this up later by adding a second piece of wire. So let's imagine that we have filled all of this with nice tidy wraps of that 0.5 24 gauge. All we're going to do, let's just pull that out of the way. I've come underneath on this side. However, this is where I'm going to change it up. I'm going to go to underneath on this side as well. I'm not going to go for a figure of 8. What I want to have here is the wire sitting as close to the gemstone as possible and avoiding any bumpy feelings. So if you just allow that to sit centrally before you bring that tail of wire around and start wrapping across the bottom of that scroll, you need to make sure that the scroll is going to sit symmetrically on both sides. You do have a little bit of wiggle room. You might be able to just tease that open slightly if you wanted to. but all we would do here is wrap around the lower part of that scroll. So it's come from underneath. So I'm going to just pinch those two scrolls together really strongly, draw the tail of wire around and push it up inside the loop, and you're just going to coerce that through if you need to with your pliers. Make sure that it's not too tight across there. You don't want it to be super wide on one side and super close on the other. So just make sure that you're happy with that, and then continue wrapping all the way around. And if you've got enough wire, I would suggest probably for this you're looking to use about 15 inches just to be on the safe side. And it's a single piece of wire, and you just end up on the other side of the scroll, draw across in exactly the same fashion, start wrapping around here, and in the middle section you will meet those two coils. They will come together and it will look lovely. Something like this. As is my prerogative, I went and changed my mind and I have replaced that wrong coloured wire with some gold wire. So what we've essentially made so far is a little basket into which our slab sits. If you were very, very delicate, you could probably still slide that out. Let's not do that, and let's prevent that from happening in wear. Head back down to the board with me now and we'll get to the very last part of today's tutorial. So we've got a kind of basket into which we're sliding this little slab or inverted flat obelisk. If you were canny, you probably could slide that out and make your life slightly easier with the weaving around just down at the bottom here. But what we need to do is make sure that we're happy with all the tensions. I'm going to push that down a little bit further into the basket. If you find that you don't have enough tension across this zone, you can very softly tighten up that spiral slightly and you'll find that you get the tension that you need. If it's too tight and you can't draw the piece down far enough, you could open that out gently. So very, very carefully. Don't really want to see the ends of pliers going onto gemstones, but this is my demonstration piece. Just going to get that little bit flat down so that the finished piece looks nice and neat and tidy. So to finish off, we're going to use our round form to retain the shape of that up at the top so that we can still get that heavy rope necklace material through. I'm just going to make sure that this goes down as far as I'm comfortable with it. And then I'm going to use some flat pliers now. I love these. They were incredibly cheap, really, really handy things to have. I'm just going to use them to draw the two pieces of that bail together over the top of my gemstone section. So I'm being very, very gentle. I'm doing one side first and then the other side. If you don't have these, you can use your standard chain nose pliers, and just be careful when you're pulling that down that you can make a little bit of a dent. So that what we're looking to do at this stage is to bring some of that across the top of the piece. If you think that perhaps your mandrel that you're using is too tight, you can very simply remove it and be careful to not squish it too much. So I'm going to very gently grip and push, and what we've done is we've created a housing at the top, which means that that slab can no longer go north. So there we have completed our wrapped crystal point pendant or slab obelisk, whatever you want to call it. Couple of different variations for you there with the very, very closed figure of 8 or the very open figure of 8 weaving. Either of them will fit onto a reasonably large necklace or thong or whatever you want to hang them from, and they are indeed quite secure. I hope that you've enjoyed making these with me today. Slightly longer video than usual, but I think that if you give it a go, you'll be quite pleased with the results. Thank you so much for hanging out with me here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Have a beautiful day and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.